introduced the BEC program to you, and in previous tutorials we've alluded to and talked about to some extent the whole issue of proficiency in language and culture. And now we're going to talk more about what proficiency is and why we care about that, what we mean in describing proficiency as our ability to function effectively in language. And so in this tutorial we want to see that in real time, in a sense, as we talk about how to adequately evaluate the ability of a person in a second language and culture. What are some of the primary factors that are involved in an evaluation that's focused on proficiency? Now, we talk about proficiency, as I've said, and so we ask ourselves, why do we care to evaluate proficiency? Many universities in Australia, for example, and other places as well, would require a prospective student to meet some kind of a minimum level of ability in a second language like English, in speaking, reading, writing, listening, all four of those areas, before they're allowed to enroll. And why is that the case? Well, because there's a minimal language level that's needed for a person to be an effective functioner, to function well in a university course, to be successful. They need to understand the lectures. They need to be able to write and do the assignments. They have to interact in speaking with supervisors. They've got to engage in reading written material, work in group situations, maybe social settings. And so they've established, these superiors have established minimal levels below which the person simply would not be able to effectively function in the role that they have as a student in the course. And so the Australian citizenship test, for example, includes an English evaluation, as well as key Australian historical and cultural areas. This is another example of an attempt to evaluate competency. And the rationale, they give a rationale for that test, which describes the responsibilities and the privileges of being a citizen. And the test also being designed to assess basic knowledge of English as the national language of the country. So we could say that in these examples, that proficiency evaluations like that, they gauge a person's ability to communicate well enough to function in certain roles in the society that have been established, either in one case, as on the one hand, as a university student, or secondly, in second case, as a citizen of the country. Well, those are examples of proficiency settings or functions that require a certain kind of proficiency. That's the case for church planting as well, that we have a desire to see those individuals learning, in this case, someone like yourself, wanting to see you engage effectively in a cross-cultural church planting situation, and to know that you have reached a sufficient level of ability and understanding to be able to actually achieve or fulfill that role. And so as we think about that, it would be good for us to consider some of the specific kinds of functional abilities and levels of understanding that someone who's involved in cross-cultural church planting may need to have. Depending on the specific role in the context of church planting, that these are the kinds of abilities, the kinds of functions that you would need to fulfill. For example, let's talk about relationships. What kinds of functions in relationships would indicate sufficient proficiency? Well, we want to see that you have developed relationships that are sufficiently deep enough so that there are some in the community who are willing to be influenced by you on a very fundamental and worldview level. That you've gained sufficient respect to have people that are really willing to listen to you, to hear what you have to say. Also then, we would expect for you as a person invested in relationships to have the kinds of deep relationships that would allow you to create a team, to be a part of helping you with tasks like translation or literacy program development, or other kinds of work that are a regular part of what is before you as a church planter or a person involved in church planting. And then more than that you would need to have a wide-ranging group of contacts, a broad network in the community in order to gather the kind of data and make decisions about, like a literacy program, for example, or translation issues, and to be able to relate to people adequately well enough to be able to gain their approval and have them willing to participate in the improvement of skills like that. And so in that area of relationships, then, we think about the depth of relationship required. And then in cultural insight, as a person who's competent in cultural areas, that you can accumulate and explain sufficiently well with authority what it takes to do pre-evangelism and to contrastively teach about cultural issues that are relevant to the biblical worldview. That you have an understanding of the frames that people have in their minds when they come to think of certain concepts, and you know how to relate biblical spiritual truths, key concepts from the Scriptures to those cultural frames in an adequate way so that they can be clearly understood. And thinking about, you're able to talk through and think through the cultural themes, the primary threads in the society where you're ministering and working, to prepare to teach and to address those themes from a biblical perspective, to have insight culturally in predicting those areas that will be obstacles, the great obstacles, the large obstacles for people accepting the foundational truths of God's story. That you would be able to have a bank of cultural illustrations that you can draw from to teach truth. And then that you'll be able to be working through the development of that key kind of terminology that is involved in translation of the Scriptures. That you'll have the information, the knowledge culturally to know the areas of meaning, the semantic domains that those function in. Then you'll be able also to know the cues that allow you culturally, in an appropriate way, to monitor an audience for the way that they're understanding the message and the way they're accepting the message that is being taught to them. And then also, in addition to cultural insight and relationships, thinking about communicative ability and language, that you'll have the communication skills that are really necessary to teach well, to do pre-evangelism, and so pre-teaching, and then teach in a relevant way, in a relevant setting, God's Word. And you'll be able to know the language well enough to have the ability to make good use of it in thinking through the genre, the types of genre, and the natural discourse features that should occur with a high level of speaking, and the communication skills that are required to teach those early literacy classes, and to encourage students to answer their questions, ask good questions, evaluate even the effectiveness of your program, and on we go with the kinds of tasks required to initiate, as we've described, Bible translation projects, and identify good and poor communication along with your team, and to be able to work well together with a team to accomplish that. And then for you to be able to extemporaneously address areas of culture and life that contradict or contrast with God's Word, that you can extemporaneously exposit, be an expositor of truth in those settings. So we're describing in those three areas of relationship and cultural knowledge and linguistic ability, we're describing a high level of proficiency for cross-cultural church planning. And as we think about that, we ask ourselves then, well, what kind of an evaluation is required for that? What would we need to be able to do? Because cross-cultural church planning roles, they require those areas of understanding culturally, language, and relationships that are deep. What kind of an evaluation should we have? And we would like indeed to cover those areas. We want to evaluate in our evaluations of a person, proficiency evaluations, what a person can actually do. Their ability to function in real situations in the language. Not just what they know, not formal knowledge, but the ability of the person to actually function in the language. And because of the complexity of second cultural and language acquisition, of course we know that there's no foolproof evaluation method. But we do believe that if an evaluation is based on sound principles, it will give the learner and the evaluator a very good idea of where the learner is and what they need to do to move forward toward their goal of being an effective communicator in that context. And so that evaluation is intended to let the learner know where they are and for them to understand how to move forward, and also to help to motivate them to continue to learn, to give them a clear idea and to encourage them in the ways that they need to progress, to overcome challenges that they're facing as they see areas to focus on in improvement. Now, as we think about oral proficiency and proficiency in general, one of the kinds of ways that we focus on assessment of proficiency is through what we would call an oral proficiency interview. That's really, this is a key element of our evaluation process. This is a carefully structured conversation between an interviewer who's been trained and then the person who is growing in their ability to speak a second language so that their speaking proficiency can be assessed. The interview is interactive and adjustable, adaptable, and adapts to the level of ability of the person who's being evaluated. And so the topics that are suggested and that are discussed during the interview are based on the interests and experiences of that person being evaluated, plus a combination of that with the cultural situation that they're learning about. And so there's a series of personalized questions of exchange in which the interviewer gets a really good idea of the learner's ability to handle the communication tasks for each of the levels of proficiency. And in that interview, just to summarize for you, that there's a clear establishment of the baseline of a person's ability, what we would call the floor, and then a ceiling of ability where the person's unable to consistently function beyond that point. And we often ask people to be involved in cultural role plays where they prove their ability to function in specific situations. And it's one of the proven ways that we've seen oral proficiency particularly be adequately evaluated, measured. Just as an example, we think about a role play. I've described that. And so we think about a role play like, for example, a learner, maybe we would set them up and say, let's say you have, as a learner, have a health problem, something that's appropriate to the setting here. And so what I want you to do then as a second language learner in this setting is to call the clinic and make an appointment and talk with the doctor or nurse about your symptoms. And so then they have to go through the process in the second language in a culturally appropriate way of accomplishing that role-playing task. That would just be one example in the scale of role plays that we could suggest based on the appropriate level where they're learning, one of the examples that we could give. Now, we've given you 4 interviews on the website with Module 4 that are examples of oral proficiency assessments. They're usually about a half hour long each, and when the interviewer is not a native speaker of the local language, then there's a local language speaker who takes part in the conversation and helps to negotiate the meaning of what's being said, giving correction and suggestion, and helping the evaluator to know how the learner is responding or not responding adequately. So an oral proficiency interview can give us insight into the learner's ability in really all the major areas that we need to cover, whether we're thinking of vocabulary, with adequate vocabulary use, the grammatical structures that should be present there, the kind of pronunciation we need, the fluency of speech, the kind levels of linguistic tasks and function, the sociolinguistic cultural awareness that is built into a specific social situation that would be appropriate for natives in that context. And so that oral proficiency evaluation is one of the major ways that we help to assess speaking proficiency particularly. And then also, in addition to that evaluation, that oral proficiency interview, we try to include other ways of assessing areas or aspects of proficiency. So social activities, where the learner can demonstrate their interaction with people in real situations to demonstrate that they understand how to handle themselves. Maybe a visit to a friend's home or a meal or a local event. In any place where a learner can show that they know how to naturally interact. And then our evaluations include discussions with the learner about their procedures, how they're following the Becoming Equipped to Communicate resources, what their scheduling looks like, what challenges they're facing. Explore areas of culture to know what they understand and to help give direction to them in areas where they need to grow. And then to evaluate their involvement in the community, the network of relationships that they have, how much time they spend with people. So you can see that we've developed quite a large frame of points of reference for evaluating proficiency of learners, both orally and socially, and then also culturally. So as we think about that, and we think specifically about our church planning goals, we just want to mention again, reiterate in a different way, some of the benefits of proficiency evaluation like this. One of those benefits is helping the learner to decide together with you if they're really ready to function effectively in that role that they have to do, or if they're not ready, if they need to spend more time learning. These evaluations are encouraging for learners who've worked hard to make progress, but they don't necessarily at times, because of the slow plodding nature of that learning, that maybe they aren't seeing that progress, and so it gives us an opportunity to get into a situation and help them evaluate that and to be encouraged in that. And then also gives us a way to target input for those who experience roadblocks. There are just places in learning where we tend to plateau, we tend to stop, and helps us to reinitiate, reestablish momentum and progress. And also gives the learner a snapshot of all the areas where they're growing and learning, the strengths and weaknesses that they have. A thorough evaluation like this helps a learner to adjust in the program. They may have areas where they need to modify their activities or move in this direction or the other to make the activities more productive. So we can help pinpoint weaknesses and strengths for them and help them make adjustments. Not just in the language acquisition process itself, but in cultural understanding, and also in the relationships that they have with the people around them. And so that's why we tend to focus so much on oral proficiency evaluation.